Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it might surprise you to know that despite its age, the GTX 1080 can still play games at 4K resolution. It's certainly a card best suited to 1080 and perhaps 1440p these days, as demonstrated in my recent video about this once top tier flagship, but 2160p isn't beyond the realms of possibility and playability with reduced quality settings. The reductions required for a smooth experience depend on the game and of course the preferences of the person playing, but I found that 30 frames per second can be achieved across a lot of titles without too much of a drop in visual fidelity. Even Cyberpunk 2077, which is notoriously demanding, holds a plus 30 FPS average. The settings just need to be turned all the way down. As I continued to pit the 1080 against more of my game collection though, I was quite pleased with how this 5-year-old GPU handled itself, and that got me thinking. It shouldn't have, but it did. Remember when the top tier RTX 30 series cards came out and people were talking about the possibilities of 8K gaming? The same thing happened with the latest gen consoles, though to be honest I think we're a long way from a time when 4320p becomes the norm. I mean, me and 67% of other people are still using 1920 by 1080. Less than 3% of you out there are gaming at 4K. Today's video though is more about whether we could as opposed to whether we should. I've dabbled with 8K before when I used software to upscale old games to higher resolutions with a GTX 1070, but in this one the games library is newer, the card packs more power and the frame rates will probably be a lot lower. There are a few ways we can approach the following task. We can either buy an 8K monitor for the equivalent of 10 months worth of my mortgage repayments, or we can enable DSR in the Nvidia control panel and essentially render the games at 4320p on a 2160p display. Some games will also let us increase the resolution scale by default in their menus. There is actually some sense behind these methods, as the high resolution image scaled back to the native display will make things sharper and reduce jagged edges that seem to plague some titles. I found this works best when rendering games at 4K on a 1080p screen. Again, I'd like to reiterate that rendering games at 8K, especially on a GTX 1080, doesn't really make too much sense, mainly due to performance issues. If like me though you like to mess about with hardware simply for the sake of it though, then why not give it a go? Let's start with the games I showcased at the start. Cyberpunk 2077 at 8K turns into a slideshow. The VRAM usage maxes out and pretty much stays at the number that the card has available. There's no gradual build up or anything, it just shoots straight up to max and stays there, which was an obvious outcome really. Still, 9 FPS is better than nothing. Not much better, but better. I can't complain because I didn't really expect playability today in any of the games. We're just seeing what this old flagship can really do. What I like about Far Cry 6 is that it tells you how much VRAM each setting will use. 8K with the lowest preset requires 20GB, and if you want to dare select Ultra, then that'll be 23 gigs you owe this open world action adventure. And that's without the HD texture pack. It doesn't matter what you choose because the game will crash anyway, and that goes for choosing native 8K or doubling the render scale from the options menu. This application has been terminated in an unusual way. Yes, that might have something to do with the madman trying to play at 4320p on a half-decade old GTX graphics card. No one at Ubisoft anticipated this. God of War starts but runs at about 1 frame per second, so this is a no-go as well. That's all I can really say about that. It's surprising just how big the difference really is between 4 and 8K. Basically, from what I've worked out, you need to be able to run a game with at least 80 frames per second with this card at 4K to get a playable experience at 8K, and that's no easy feat. The Witcher 3 does come close. If we set everything to low, then we hit 75 frames per second at 2160p, and while the game looks very good and rather crisp, there's no denying that I'd rather stick to 1440p with slightly higher quality settings. We're way past the point of real world recommendations here though. Because of this solid 4K result, the game will come close to 30 FPS at 8K, but ultimately it'll fall short, especially when exploring busier cities and towns. It's probably quite rare to see 30 FPS anywhere, to be honest, but again, this was to be expected. Let's not forget that this game is also older than the graphics card being used to play it. And that doesn't give me much hope for the rest of today's tested games. But there were two more tricks left up my sleeve. The first came in the form of GTA San Andreas, the definitive edition, which, when turned down to its lowest, runs really well at 4K. We certainly don't need low settings here. We probably could have turned things up to high and still hit somewhere close to 60, especially as the lowest settings really take away the whole definitive part in terms of visuals. This, however, did seem like the ideal candidate for 8K gaming on the 1080, but when I cranked up the resolution, well, we really felt the effects of the VRAM limitation. This one was playable 1 minute and then unplayable the next. It started off at 30 FPS or just above, and then it dropped to about 15, and then it shot back up to 30 in more open areas. Now, these weren't lag spikes, these were full-on prolonged periods of slowdown that came with disastrous percentile figures, no matter the average. I couldn't actually replicate the aforementioned results for the recording of the footage. The game just hit about 11 FPS and stayed there, and then it crashed. Again, this is what I expected. The phrase 8K gaming probably never gets mentioned when talking about the GTX 1080, not back in 2016, and certainly not now. But there is one game left that I wanted to try. See, a successful attempt here relies on one thing above all else, and that is an extremely well optimised game. Saints Row 2. No, I'm kidding. Forza Horizon 5. Now at 4K we don't even need the lowest settings for a decent result, at least not when driving across the desert or through little towns on our own. During multi-competitor races and events, this level of performance will drop, but we're still left with a solid average overall after combining everything. Could this be the game that allows us to achieve a playable 8K gaming experience on an old GTX 1080? Well, bumping the resolution up and leaving the settings at medium somehow means a solid stutter-free 34 frames per second. Just look at those percentile figures. Granted, we are driving solo once again. There's no competition on screen and we're away from busy villages and settlements. The low preset is definitely better. We don't have to go to very low, but utilising the low settings and keeping MSAA off improves our average frame rate by quite a bit, and driving along coastal roads or through dense jungles looks, sounds and feels pretty good. Again, the menus lag a bit and make you think that what's to come will be equally disappointing, but again, no such problems occurred in actual gameplay. It's time to enter a multi-competitor race though and see how this really holds up. After all, this is a racing game. The first race I tried was an airfield cross-country circuit that dropped the frame rate quite a bit from our earlier solo drive. The jungle area combined with the other races meant a closer to 30 FPS average, but we didn't really drop below that. It may appear that we did from the footage, but I had to actually record this with NVIDIA Shadow Play, which is built into the GeForce software, because my capture card simply refused to capture. So what you're seeing here is actually about 2 to 3 frames per second worse in terms of performance than I actually got during benchmarking. As I said before, the world map and the loading menu before starting the races actually gave us more frame rate problems. Overall, this went fairly smoothly, though I'd consider using a 30 FPS cap. The second event on A Wing and a Prayer takes us through a little town which can also wreak havoc on frame rates, but things actually held up a bit better here. We were up against some bikes, so not as much going on as the first event, but it's the environment that really affected the performance. I've no doubt that other areas and events may also cause worse performance dips than I've exhibited here, but considering we're running at 8K, well, I'm surprised, but I'm afraid that I've probably wasted 10 or so minutes of your time because this in no way makes any sense. You can game at 8K on a GTX 1080, much to my surprise, and while I'm sure Forza Horizon 5 isn't the only relatively new game that will run at over 30 FPS, you certainly shouldn't be aiming for this. But it has been fun. Somewhat pointless, but fun nonetheless, and I hope you've enjoyed watching because this was more of an experiment than anything else, and 8K on a 1080, Certainly not one of my recommendations when it comes to gaming, but thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this one, leave a like down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.